Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining today's webinar, Introduction to Food Loss and Waste. My name is Mahashe, and I am the Communications Specialist at the Feed the Future Food Systems for Nutrition Innovation Lab at Tufts University. As more attendees are joining the webinar, I will begin by going over some of the Zoom logistics. Next, please. I would like to direct all attendees to a few functions on this Zoom call. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat icon and a Q&A icon. We encourage that attendees use the chat feature to introduce yourselves and engage in relevant conversation with the other attendees. Next, please. If you have a question for our speakers, we ask that you submit them using the Q&A feature. We have allotted 25 minutes of this webinar for Q&A. Next, please. I would now like to introduce Dr. Patrick Webb, who will be the moderator for today's session. Dr. Webb is the Alexander McFarland Professor of Nutrition at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. Until 2005, Dr. Webb was the Chief of Nutrition at the United Nations World Food Program in Rome. Today, he is the Director of the Feed the Future Food Systems for Nutrition Innovation Lab. He has served on numerous task forces and global advisory panels, including currently serving on the high-level panel of experts of the Committee on World Food Security. He is technical advisor to the Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition, and he serves as one of the commissioners for the ongoing Eat Lancet 2.0 study. Patrick, over to you.
Thank you, Maha, and welcome everyone to this webinar, which is hosted by Food Systems for Nutrition Innovation Lab, that's a mouthful, in collaboration with Thriving Solutions. Briefly, the Innovation Lab is a consortium of a large group of interested institutions led by Tufts University's Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. It's funded by USAID under the Feed the Future initiative, and it's focused, it has a global focus, but it's focused in terms of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. The idea behind the lab's work is to promote the uptake and scaling of novel technologies or practices or policies that can in fact help reduce food loss and waste, and in the process improve food safety and thereby enhance access by everyone to more nutrient-rich and perishable foods. So this is the second of 3 webinars that we're doing with Thriving Solutions, focused on the first of those agendas, which is reducing food loss and waste. And we're thrilled and so honored to have presentations by 2 colleagues here. First, Sita Punjan, who's a global advocate for sustainability and circular economy and regenerative economies, particularly in water-scarce regions, although she is also working globally. For example, she co-leads the Global Food is Never Waste and is on the general board of the United Cities initiative. She holds an MS in climate change and development, and she was the founder and is the CEO of Thriving Solutions, which is a consulting firm focused on decarbonization of the economy, safeguarding biodiversity, regenerative nature. So we'll hear first from Sita, and then we'll have a few Q&A interactions before going over to Stephen Finn, who's Vice President of Sustainability and Public Affairs for Lean Path, which is a global leader in hardware and software solutions for food waste prevention. He's going to walk us through a specific example. Steve teaches graduate courses on innovation for sustainability and that super important nexus between food, water, and energy at the University of Pennsylvania, but also at Boston University in the US. And if you're interested, he's the author of a very interesting blog called Food for Thought. So we're going to have a wonderful hour and a bit together, and so I will hand over to Sita to make her presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick, and hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We are very excited today to share with you the next phase from this webinar series, and today we'll be talking about food loss and waste. Next, please. So we start with the definition. What does food, what do we refer to? So food loss and waste refers to food that exits the food system. And where it exits the food system is decides how do we define it. Next, please. So food that exits the food system between harvest or slaughter or capturing until it reaches the consumption points, we refer to it as food loss. And food that is lost and exits the food system at consumption points, be it wholesalers, retailers, food service providers, consumers at home, we refer to it as food waste. Next, please. So food loss and waste happens along the entire value chain from production and to consumption. And it happens for different reasons. So, for instance, at the farm, it could remain because the price from the buyers was too low to cover the farmer's expenses. So the harvest is not harvested. So that's a form of waste. But there are other things that could happen at the farm. And this is the same along the food value chain. Things happen and food exits the food system because of various reasons. Next, please. So if we're looking at the dimensions of the problem on a global scale, 40% of food is lost or wasted annually. And until recently, the assumption was that around 1/3 or 30% of food exits the food system. With the latest study by WWF, we discovered that at the farm during harvest or slaughter, there is a big chunk of food that is lost, much more than what was anticipated later. That's why the figure internationally has been revised to 40%. And now the food that is lost or wasted, it consumes around 25% of the water that is used for agriculture, was used to grow that food that exits the food system. Now, I must say that this is the figure depending on that 1/3 of our food exits the food system. Similarly, 28% of the land, the cultivated land, was used to grow this food that exits the food system. And food loss and waste emits 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, of course, there are enormous economic losses, environmental costs, and social costs associated with that food. Next, please. So if we're looking in total figure, more than 1 billion tons of food that is fit for human consumption gets lost or wasted. And this happens while we have 1 in 9 people are malnourished on Earth. And this figure is growing. The hunger levels globally have started growing since 2015, and it spiked even more after the pandemic, and now with the crisis of the Russian and Ukraine war. Next. So how much does one person require per year to feed for their nutritional needs? The calculation is that each of us would require an average of 1 ton of food. So if we calculate how much food is exiting the food system, and here we're talking about food that exits the food system that is fit for human consumption, and what are the figures of the global hunger level, we find that actually we can meet all of the needs of the hungry if we can just manage our food loss and waste. Next, please. So how do we address this big food waste problem? We'll touch upon today the major approach that is utilized is to adopt an evidence-based approach. It's very important that whatever initiative we undertake are built on evidence, and that they are systemic, meaning that they look at the whole food system. And we covered the food system last webinar. For those that did not attend, please feel free to look at the link. But we covered what does the food system and the systemic approach entail. And it's built on 3 phases, which is target. Target sets ambition. And of course, ambition motivates us to act. And then the measurement, what gets measured gets managed. And the 4th is action. So what we want is action, but that action needs to be built really on evidence, the measurement, and to address the targets that we want so that we can get the results that we seek. Next, please. So in terms of target, there are already global targets. We have the SDG 12, the target number 3 under it aims to halve per capita global food waste at the retail and consumption levels and to reduce food loss. And there are two indicators under that. The indicator 12.3.1, which is food loss index, and that is managed by FAO. And then we have indicator 12.3.2, that should be global food waste index, and that's managed by UNEP. Next, please. So then the measurement. To measure, we have to accompany those global indexes and the global targets. We are seeking to measure. There is the Global Food Loss and Waste Accounting and Reporting Standard, is the global protocol for measurement. And under that, we have SDGs, which is the Food Loss Index, which is the FAO index, is built on that methodology. Similarly, the Food Waste Index methodology is built on the Food Loss and Waste Accounting and Reporting Standard. So the accounting and reporting standard for the food loss and waste standard is actually the key, and many industry methodologies other than the Global Food Index and food waste is built on it. And that's the starting with the hotel waste management methodology that was issued in 2021, but we expect other methodologies to also, for the industry methodologies, to come along in the future as the food waste index requirements get rolled out next year. Next, please. So this is the whole value chain, and it depending on where your institution is when you measure your food loss or waste, this is how you categorize it as food loss or food waste index. Now, the loss that occurs during harvest or during slaughter within the farms and the production units, that can be added to the food loss index. Next, please. Now, the protocol identifies very clear steps on how do you go about carrying the measurement itself at your institution. So there are, we start with defining, which is what are the goals of the institutions from measuring? Is it only reporting to the government? Is the institution seeking some environmental or climate targets? Because that would, there are different tips and different ways on how to measure food depending on the target. And then looking at reviewing, establishing the scope, or is the institution going, or the country, it could be the institution, of course, it could be the municipality or the city, it could be the country on a level. So the scope of the study needs to be well defined from the start. And then there needs to be a decision on how do you quantify food loss and waste. There are different mechanisms identified in the protocol that allow you to quantify in different ways. Some of them are more general, and some of them are more specific. And then based on that, we go ahead with the gathering of the data, analyzing it, calculating it, assessing the uncertainty within the measurement. Usually measurements occurs over a full year to account for seasonality differences. And then based on that, we do the reporting, and we then, it's an optional if the institution or the who's measuring or the entity that's measuring wants to set targets for tracking food loss and waste over time. Next, please. Another important dimension in the protocol is the need to identify the material part. Of course, food includes both the edible component, but also the inedible parts. So if the organization wants to also address and look at inedible parts, that the protocol allows for that, because at the end of the day, inedible parts are part of the organic material. Some inedible parts in some countries or in some cultures might be edible in other cultures. So this is, and of course, when you send those inedible parts to the landfill, they generate greenhouse gases, and many of the valorization methods can actually address and valorize inedible parts. So organizations are given the freedom to decide whether they want to just measure food, the edible or the inedible part. Another major component in the food loss and waste protocol is the destination. The food that exits the food system, where does it go? Because depending on where that food goes, also can help in either allocating it as food loss or waste, or allocating it as food that goes to a use that actually keeps it in the food system. So although it is a loss for one entity, it is not a food waste for the community or for the city or the country that's reporting it. Next. So why do we measure, or what are the incentives for the city or for the country or for the institution to measure food loss and waste? First of all, it identifies the hotspots within and the interventions that the institution can take. And of course, wasted food is wasted money. So if they can identify and develop useful and effective intervention, that means it saves money for the institution. It helps them to calculate the scope of the opportunity. Once you measure and identify how much you're losing, where are you losing it, why are you losing it, what interventions you can adopt and how much they would cost, you can calculate what's your opportunity loss. Of course, there are environmental concerns also in terms of reducing your land, water, fertilizer, fuel, carbon footprint. We can develop case studies and best practices, and we can comply as well with global and local reporting requirements, because there are global requirements that are coming that would be in effect for countries to measure their food loss and waste. Next, please. Now, if we look at the latest UNEP report or the Food Waste Index report of 2021, we would notice that in Africa, just for household, out of the 58 countries, only one country, which is Ghana, has high confidence data, which means they have actually done detailed studies to identify and measure their household food waste and to be able to identify what is being lost and how can they intervene to reduce it. In Asia, out of the 50 countries, also only one country, which is Saudi Arabia, has high confidence data for its household and retail. So this is really an issue for countries that want to address their food waste problem and seek to identify mechanisms to reduce it. Next. So the last step in the Target Measure Act is action. And action, we can divide it in 3 categories. The first one, which is the most important and should be the first priority for any institution, is prevention. We want to prevent that food from exiting the food system in the first place. The second one is redistribution. So we can prevent as much a lot of food from exiting the food system, but the type of food is a perishable item, and we can't always calculate exactly how much we need to produce for people and people will consume. So there is bound to be surplus food that is fit for human consumption that we couldn't prevent from losing. So the next step should be redistributing, finding ways to redistribute it to within the system so it still reaches humans and it is consumed. And the third priority then comes valorization. How do we valorize it? Next. So prevention. So amongst the best prevention mechanisms, for instance, is adopting best management practices to prevent food waste. And we have a case study, for instance, here in Spinneys in the UAE. They have managed to nearly eliminate their food waste. What they've done is the produce that is not sold, they turn it into meals, they turn it into juices, or they package it in terms of ways that the people can pick small packages for daily use. They even have a basket at the exit for donation. So if something is nearing expire the same day or a day before, they put it outside, people can pick it as they move out. Next. Other prevention technologies include enabling technology, which is the use of technology can really enable us to prevent food. And there are very many successful case studies around. So we have one of the first apps that came is Too Good To Go, which connects consumers to businesses via an app. Businesses can market their surplus food and customers get a surprise bag depending on the surplus of that day. There are different other apps that are modeled according to the Too Good To Go. We have a food memo app. This helps retailers actually to take stock of all of their retail stock, and then it helps them track the expiry dates. So retailers are enabled to identify on every day what stock they have that is nearing expiry so that they could make special offers around it and so on. And this has also been an app that has been very successful in reducing loss and waste at the retail. We have another example, which is Lean Path, where you will listen from Lynn later on in depth about this app. Next. The third one is redistribution. How can we redistribute food that will be exiting the food system? Many people are familiar. It has been long for decades. Food banks are there, and this has been the customary way for redistribution. But we've noticed lately that there's other means that are coming up. We have community fridges that are springing in many communities in many countries, where people can bring what extra food they have that is nearing expiry and put it in these fridges, knowing that they will not consume it, but others can pick it up. We also have reduced price outlets that are collecting from retailers food nearing expiry, or ugly fruits and vegetables, or something that will not appeal to some retailers, and they're offering them at reduced prices. Next, please. So valorization is the third priority. And what we mean by valorization is we convert the food waste or the byproducts of food, which is the inedible part, into higher value products that contribute back to the food supply chain. And this, of course, contributes, other than reducing food loss and waste, it also contributes to the economy, because material that would have once left and went to the landfill are recycled back into the supply chain, and there are new businesses emerging. Next, please. So if we're looking at the valorization of food loss and waste, of course, the first step is what we covered, prevention. The next step is redistribution. Then in valorizing, we have upscaling food for human consumption, and we have repurposing or upscaling food for animal feed. Now, these two components of the valorization, remember when we talked about the steps in terms of destination. So if the company or the entity is sending food for upcycling for other food products or repurposing it for animal feed, that means that food will stay in the food value chain. And according to the protocol, this food basically is going to be calculated on the city scale as not food waste. So this is reduction in food waste. Now we have other important valorization also mechanisms. Not everything can maybe be upcycled for food or feed, which is we can repurpose some of the byproducts and waste for industry or for composting, or even for waste to energy, which is the last priority. In the hierarchy, it equates with landfills because that's how the protocol identifies it. So if these are the destinations where the food waste or loss is happening when you're logging it in, it actually on the grand scheme at the institution or country level is calculated still as food waste. Next. And now we will talk about a few of the valorization options, especially those that are calculated as food waste reduction. So we have the upcycling of food, and this is in ways that we repurpose and transform food and into something that is consumable. So we have this company, for instance, in Netherlands, they collect used coffee grounds for businesses, especially cafes and so on, and they mix it with some soil and then they grow mushrooms. So if we're looking at their production, for instance, last year they were able to collect between 6,000 and 7,000 kilograms and to convert it into coffee grounds, and they produce around 1,200 to 1,400 kilograms of mushrooms monthly. So this is the coffee grounds collected, on a monthly basis. Next. Then we have repurposing for feed. The conventional way that has been used for centuries is extra food is then given to either the livestock, to the poultry in terms of scrapes, and that's utilized by them. More recent and developed and innovative ways is next is next, Maha, please, is converting food waste for insect feed, especially like the black soldier fly is currently being farmed in many countries. The larvae of the black soldier fly is packed with protein and many minerals and vitamins. And these minerals and vitamins are essential for animal growth. So they are a very good feedstock for fish, for poultry, and they have a very high conversion rate, and also on the economies of scale are now profitable for economies for farming. They can use both food loss and waste, but also other types of organic waste. We have food for feed plant that is operational in the Netherlands from 2006. And that plant actually collects bread, it collects dough, biscuit, pastry, toast, cookies and sweets and other kinds of products that you won't imagine are good for animals, but they have managed to convert it into semi-finished foodstuff, into high quality animal feed. So they were able to get really food that we would not consider that is edible as livestock, but they've managed to really turn it into a very good quality animal feed. And it's a growing operation. And I put this up because basically it gives an idea that we can view sometimes food that this food cannot be valorized or turned into feed or into a product that would keep it in the food system, but there's always room for research and to innovate. Next, please. So other valorization options which are included for repurposing for industry, like we can have, for instance, one of the technologies also out of the Netherlands, because Netherlands has really invested the longest time into circularity and looking at circular economy, is how do they convert orange peel into actually cloth and thread material. And then we have composting. There are different ways for composting food, and then we have waste to energy. We will not cover those in terms of case studies today, because these basically, when we do them, these are still accounted as food loss and waste, although they are part of the circular economy and they do have a role to play. Next. And I think with that, we can move to Q&A.
Thank you, Sita. That was very interesting, as always, and we're getting lots of questions and comments. Much appreciated. So first, I just want to say it's great to see the diversity of the participants today in terms of professional positions and the wide range of countries from which people were connecting. So that just confirms just how valuable this topic is for so many different people. Right, so Sita, we have a variety of different questions. I mean, actually the first that came in was about the inedible parts. You did talk about that. And to what extent, should one seek to measure or valorize edible versus non-edible explicitly, or should they be combined, or what's your thinking on the non-edible part? Is that how important?
Okay. So that's a very critical question. So some things that we might view inedible can actually be edible. So if we're looking at the fishing industry, for instance, fish skins are considered inedible in some industries and they're thrown away. So the industry might consider that an inedible component that they would not measure and that they would just discard. But there are upcycling companies in the US actually that are turning the fish into snacks. So there are dried snacks such as chips, something instead of chips that you can snack, a healthy snack on, and it has a market. So that within the US, where they have been discarding this and using it, thinking it is inedible, it did have a market that is an appealing market. Other components is that we talked about insect, the black soldier fly. Black soldier flies actually consume inedible components. They even consume bones, fish bones, or poultry bones or animal bones. So that's a part that has a use, and the entity can actually account for it in the destination as something that it would have been considered food waste, but because they're sending it for insect breeding, then they have contributed to reducing their food waste. And there are other examples as well.
Mm-hmm. So as we move forward in the measurement and valorization, we do have to bear in mind not to double count in a sense, right? Make sure that what was waste, if it is now used, isn't actually waste. It's been upscaled.
Exactly. So for the institution that is sending it to a destination, the new destination, instead of the landfill, to, for instance, reusing it for another industry or for insect, that industry calculates it as a reduction, what they have done in terms of reducing it.
Exactly. So there's a lot of questions about, okay, what do we do, right? And that's inevitable. There's a comment from Ethiopia about an egg powder processing plant that used to essentially waste the shells, but now the shells are used to contribute to the feed for the chicken and fertilizer. So can you give either examples of those, success stories like that in low-income countries, and there's others who are asking specifically about higher-income countries like the UAE. What are some of the successful agendas here?
Okay, so in Africa across, there are many countries actually in Africa that are raising black soldier flies. So it is not something, it is the ISIPE Center in Kenya is leading research on that area, and they have a lot of videos. There's a lot of examples from many countries, and there's also educational videos on how can farmers adopt that at a small scale within their farms. So this is one of the examples. But I think a lot of the reusing it for keeping it in the food system depends on local culture. Food that is not culturally appropriate to the local context is not considered food. So for instance, we talk about chicken legs. Chicken legs are not consumed in many countries in the world, but in China, they're a delicacy and they're consumed. So it's very difficult to give examples for different countries because it's very local specific, but there are different valorization taking place in many countries. Now in the UAE specifically, we do have a insect breeding black soldier fly facility. They've been testing for a few years now. We also have an app like Hero Go, which is similar to Too Good To Go. We have other, I think Lean Path today, when Finn explains, he also would cover, but they're also present in the region here. So things are coming up. But with more awareness, such as the webinar we have today, the objective actually of USAID, who sponsored us, is to raise awareness, because once people are aware about something, they can start looking at it and identifying the opportunities. And there are many opportunities for a circular economy.
Yeah, thanks for that. So on the issue of, things are context specific and culture specific, no question. That may also apply to what is measured, right, and how you measure. It's going to be quite challenging to standardize all the measures globally, and I think we have to distinguish between trying to track at a global level versus measurement that allows us to do better within a country or within a sector. And so someone was asking, Morvarid was asking, should measurement be based on commodity groups or tons or dollars or CO2 equivalents? I think I can guess your answer, but how would you respond to that?
So depending on the methodology, whether you use FAO's one for loss or the UNEP one for waste. So the FAO's methodology, it actually looks at within each commodity group, the country picks a certain commodity in that food basket to measure the loss across the value chain until it reaches the food consumption point, and then that is extrapolated on the national level. So that's at the country level in terms of measuring loss. For UNEP, it identifies food waste. How do you measure it at consumption points? And according to the latest food waste index report, there are 3 levels for the country to decide or to basically move from one level up the ladder to the next level to measure according to the protocol. With the first one being more in general terms and estimation, and going up to really doing detailed analysis and assessment. Of course, for the governments to do that, institutions and producers need to be on board. So that's why it's a tiered approach. Now, everything depends on the protocol. Why? You unified it to be able to compare across institutions, across cities, across countries. At the same time, for those, the protocol is accessible online, and it is it's a very simple step-by-step document that allows you. There are companies such as ours as well, which facilitates and assists institutions to define their food loss and waste inventory sheet on how they want to measure. Now, it gives freedom for companies to identify the scope of what they want to measure, how they want to measure it, because there are different ways to measure it, and what they want to measure, what they don't want to measure, edible, inedible. The important thing is that it's identified from the start, it's consistent, and at the end, it's included in the report, because this allows comparability.
Yeah. Maybe while Stephen is presenting, you could throw the link to that in the chat so people
Sure.
could directly go to it. Because a lot of questions are about how do we do that?
Yeah.
One question on the food apps, that the various food apps that you talked about, they seem to be exploding globally in this kind of space. Are there any that are designed or dedicated to the measurement process? Do you know of any apps that have been designed to help
the measurement itself? Not to my knowledge yet. No.
So there's a gap that
Yes,
some participants could maybe take.
There is one actually. Stand corrected. There is one at in the UK with DRAP, which is they have a tool online where hospitality and different food service providers can actually measure their food and enter it, and then it calculates for them, for instance, greenhouse gases, losses in economics, and money-wise, and so on.
That's great.
Yeah.
So there are many. You mentioned, the along the value chain, supply chain loss happening on the farm and post between farm and consumer, and of course consumer as well. So Brian is asking, would in fact shorter supply chains, localized supply, do we have any evidence that short supply chains have less loss and waste versus the longer supply chain? Or is it really a matter of what technologies are applied and how the supply chain is managed?
Yeah, I think, that's how the supply chain is managed, because you can have short supply chains and it's not under cold conditions or inappropriate conditions for storing and transport that could deem food unsafe. And then there could be long supply chains that are carried really according to best management practices that yields less food loss and waste. However, it's all estimation, and that's why we really need to measure. When food loss and waste was brought to the global agenda as a problem in 2013 by FAO, at the time, everyone presumed that food waste is high in developed countries and food loss is high in developing countries because they are the major producers, the infrastructure is not as well, and so on. But that food waste is low in developing countries. Now, as measurement commenced, the understanding now is that food loss is high as well in developed countries, and food waste is comparable in developing countries to the figures in developed countries. So there are really no standards unless we measure and we understand. And also initially the assumption was that there is not as much loss that is happening during harvest and slaughter, But once WWF did the study 2 years ago, we now know that it's around 15%. So it raised the global figures from 30% to 40%.
And it depends on which foods we're talking about as well. I mean, there's a huge
Which
range.
food, how were they produced? Did they, there are so many variables depending on the local conditions, on the infrastructure, on the farm itself, on the capacity of the harvesters, so many conditions. So it's difficult really to say this is the standard.
Yeah. Not wanting to repeat, I mean, Bikash has just said, is there a recommended method for reduction of food waste? Well, again, it depends, right? It depends. This all speaks to what you're talking about understanding the nature of the problem locally and applying the most appropriate method.
Yes.
It does depend, and you know, there's a lot of generalization around food loss and waste, but it really does depend on which food, which context, what are the technologies applied in the management, and so on.
Yeah. And there's a lot of food waste occurring in the households. Like when we're looking at households, the highest category of food waste is actually at the household level. So, and if you ask anyone, they wouldn't really estimate the extent of the waste that is occurring at the house. So one of the recommendations that is, and this demonstrates why measurement is important, households are asked to put a separate bin for the food that is wasted, basically thrown away because it was expired, they cooked, overcooked, for several reasons. And this was a major motivation for many households to start really taking action, because most were just astounded at the amount of waste they themselves waste when compared to how much they estimated before they started this exercise.
Which is a great answer. Several people asked, well, what can we do at the household level? Raise awareness is one, and help them measure is another.
And it would demonstrate why measurement is important, because once you measure and you start separating, you understand what you are actually wasting. So then you can start identifying how can you reduce or take measures to reduce that waste. And one household would be completely different than maybe the neighboring household.
Absolutely true. So before handing over to Stephen, there's Sharif in Jordan who's doing for his master's degree, asking, well, what should he focus on? What would be one important question for food waste at a household level in Jordan?
So in Jordan, the confidence data, they don't have really good data also for food for food loss and waste. So if we're targeting households, it would be with awareness and maybe raising awareness about households to measure their food waste in separate bins to identify interventions. There's also a lot of opportunities in Jordan for waste reduction. Jordan is my home country, so I am very familiar with it. Currently in the capital, Amman, the estimation is that 50% of the waste in the landfill is actually organic waste. And this is it's a big challenge for a country that imports so much of its food because of water scarcity, but it also offers big opportunities in terms of how can we minimize it and maybe valorize it in industries that could encourage SMEs to come up.
Great, very positive. So thanks, Sita. We'll ask you to come back when we do the final wrap-up Q&A. But right now, let's go over to Steve and hear more about specific examples and case studies. So the floor is yours, Steve.
Great, thank you. Good to be here, everyone, at this important session on food loss and waste reduction. Certainly one of the best things that we can do to transform food systems and accelerate progress toward the SDGs is to scale food waste reduction globally and optimally by preventing it from occurring in the first place. So let me start with an introduction to LeanPath. Next slide, please. So at LeanPath, we specialize in measurement-focused technology solutions to prevent the occurrence of food waste in the food service sector. We just heard about the importance of measurement. We've created this sector. We've been doing this for about 20 years now. We're headquartered in Oregon in the United States with additional offices in the UK and China. We're leading food waste prevention efforts in 40 countries around the globe, 40 plus. We're a certified B Corporation, and our mission is to make food waste prevention and measurement everyday practice in the world's kitchen. So we're cutting food waste, inspiring clients, and changing cultures through this work, really making food waste prevention a part of organizational DNA. Next slide, please. And for food service operations, reducing food waste is really important. As many of you know, Project Drawdown recently ranked food waste reduction as the top solution for addressing climate change. So food service providers have a hierarchy of solutions to address food waste, and food waste prevention is at the top of the hierarchy. It's the highest impact solution. It avoids all of the externalities along the food supply chain by when you prevent that food from being grown, distributed, and ultimately wasted at the end of the day. And so to do that and prevent food waste in food service operations, the best way to do that, the highest impact solution, is through daily measurement. Next slide, please. And to take that a step further, tracking is the highest level prevention effort. As the Refed Insights engine notes, food waste tracking is the highest ranked solution in terms of financial benefit for food service operations. Many people on the call may have seen the Insights engine. Next slide. So to get a little more granular, the current reality in food service is that costs are up, supply chain challenges are persisting, there's historic labor shortages, there's a lot of pressure to do more with less. And at the same time, with all these challenges, consumers are demanding more sustainable practices. It's a tough environment right now. The typical kitchen, we find, wastes anywhere between 4 and 10% of purchases. So if you have €1 million food spend, for example, or $1 million US food spend, you are going to be wasting anywhere from €40,000 or dollars to €100,000 or dollars along the way. So that is big. Next slide, please. So the good news for food service operations is that they can take control of their food waste with a focus on tracking, measurement, and behavior change. We help organizations to cut their costs from and save anywhere from 2 to 8% on their food purchasing costs, get more efficiency in their operations, reduce labor costs, and also lower their disposal fees. Through that work, engaging staff. We know that employees want to be employed at operations where they can find more meaning at work, more job satisfaction, and also to become more resilient, right? Food waste tracking data gives real-time insights into the operational effectiveness of organizations with data analytics to guide the efficiency of operations. Next slide. So one key starting point for leaders in food service organizations is to change the risk paradigm. We find that food service often wastes food to manage risk, right? No one wants to run out of food. There's a great fear of that. So there's a lot of overproduction. To avoid that, there's a lot of focus on priority on food safety issues. So production of a lot of food and rapid turnover. So you have a number of reasons where operations sort of it's kind of culturally ingrained that they're going to overproduce and as a result waste a lot of food. Next slide, please. So at LeanPath, we seek to change the thinking, change that risk paradigm, if you will, and to move from a diversion focus to a prevention focus. Again, this is the highest level of the hierarchy. It helps organizations, through our work preventing the occurrence of the food waste, you maximize the financial, environmental, and social benefits. And with that upfront prevention focus, we also help organizations to enable the downstream recovery efforts as well. Next slide, please. So early in our development, we came to this key realization that food waste was the elephant in the kitchen. It was very large, but often unseen and not discussed. In many cases, excessive waste has been tolerated due to a culture of abundance around food. And in other organizations, food waste wasn't a safe point of discussion, right? So we changed that by making food waste visible, the elephant visible, so that it can be measured and analyzed and prevented going forward. Next slide, please. So it's worth noting that food waste prevention has been challenging for many food service operations to date for several reasons. Some think that food waste has been difficult to measure. For others, it's been difficult to obtain and analyze good data. For others, it's been hard to get staff members engaged in the process. I often hear the statement that food waste measurement is hard and it's expensive. So we flipped that. Actually, the metrology piece, the measurement piece, is one of the easiest things that we do because we've been doing this and developing the technology for 20 years. We shouldn't look at this as expensive either, because it's an investment in savings. There's a high ROI opportunity here. And if you're gaining an ROI of anywhere from 2 to 7x, any controller would sign up for that. So we flip that statement. We need to look at this as an investment in savings, and to consider the fact that measurement is actually pretty easy. Next slide, please. So we flip this paradigm. We have through a process that we call track, discover, and drive with our clients. Food service operations can track and measure all cases of food waste in seconds with comparison against an established baseline. They can discover prevention opportunities through our data analytics software, and they can drive results through operational changes and through behavior change features to create a culture of food waste prevention. Next slide. So we have a proven process for this, which is made possible through our integrated measurement tools. As you can see, we have a suite of products designed and customized to fit the needs of kitchens of all sizes, ranging from lightweight scales to benchtop units with digital photography to floor scales as well. So a number of products fitting the needs of all kitchens. Next slide. So on the measurement end, the important thing here is that we provide instant impact, right? So at the end of each food waste transaction, which takes a handful of seconds, staff can see the impact of that transaction immediately. So it's that visual nature is very powerful. They see the financial impact of that waste, which is extrapolated over the course of a year, and they see the environmental impact of that waste too, in terms of carbon and water equivalents as well. So that really resonates. It gives staff a perspective on the impact that they can have through their daily work, and it educates and empowers them. Next slide, please. So at LeanPath, we also leverage the power of data. So data from the site's food waste transactions is automatically analyzed and presented with vivid graphics and extensive drill down capability. So operators can see and they can understand what comprises their food waste events, and they can drill down into that in myriad ways to glean actionable data insights, such as viewing their top wasted food items, the top reason codes for their waste, the trends in their waste over time, ongoing savings against baseline. They can do roll-ups across sites and much more. Next slide, please. We also amplify that data with the power of pictures, because as we all know, the picture is worth 1,000 words, right? So with certain models, we provide digital images which are stored with the data from each transaction forever. So this really allows deeper insights as to why the food was wasted, and it further helps to identify training opportunities, such as night skill training to reduce food waste, or changes to portion sizes, or repurposing opportunities. So a host of things that chefs can engage their staff in to reduce waste going forward. Next slide. So we talk about this in terms of moving beyond measurement. Our system provides multiple features to harness data for action. We have a number of reports, daily and weekly reports, that chefs can utilize to keep the team focused on particular food waste items and trends. Our impact feature allows chefs to see details of food waste that's prevented over defined periods. We have a donation dashboard, which gives insights into how much food was donated and helps move that focus upward to prevention. We have a transactions tab that gives comprehensive details about every food waste transaction processed. And our tracker functionality continually reinforces awareness of details with images that are visible of the last item tracked, for example, so that the staff see that continually across the operation. So that visibility is really powerful. Next slide, please. In addition, we provide goals and alert features. We have instant alerts, which allow chefs to receive emails for predefined scenarios. So for example, if you're a chef, naturally you would be concerned about high cost items such as filet mignon or lobster. And so anytime one of those items is processed as a transaction, you will get a notification, and you can have a conversation and take that as an opportunity to have a positive intervention with your staff, and come up with discuss ways to perhaps repurpose that food so that it doesn't go to waste, or more importantly, to have a conversation about how do we prevent this situation from occurring. We also have goal functionality, allowing chefs to hone in on specific problem items, and they can set goals for reduction over defined periods, say 3 weeks. And so our system will automatically track progress against that goal over time. So it's another layer within the measurement focus that we have at LeanPath. So all this data and the process yields insights to drive operational and behavior change. So generating that data through consistent tracking and measurement and acting on it is really the key to the change here. And that's what we're scaling. And that kind of addresses some of the questions that are coming up in the chat. Next slide, please. So with Lean Path, you can also set enterprise goals as well. And so if you're an organization with multiple sites in a particular region, for example, you can set enterprise goals and you can see the roll-up of progress across the organization. And so when we find that organizations that go to that additional level of using the goal functionality achieve even greater waste savings. Next slide, please. So much of our work obviously is focused on pre-consumer waste, that waste that's occurring in the kitchen in food service operations, but we also have a post-consumer product called Lean Path Spark, and this allows clients to engage their patrons in food waste reduction as well, provides data on plate waste levels, as well as educational messaging to spur diners to change their individual behavior and waste less. So to the point about consumer food waste that came up before, we're also helping to raise awareness and change behavior for food waste reduction at the really crucial consumer level. So consumers can take some of this messaging and knowledge home with them from the workplace. Next slide, please. So to sum up here, it's really important to note that food waste prevention can't happen without measurement. Measurement is really the key, and data insights are the basis for behavior change, right? So this is a process that's together. Measurement provides the data, and data we act on to drive behavior change in operations. Next slide. So really, it's time for action in the food waste sector right now, really through leadership, taking control of food waste dramatically, increases food service efficiency, yields triple bottom line benefits. And so we're trying to really, as we lead this scaling effort around the globe, is to really push for leadership, have organizational leaders make bold commitments to food waste reduction, and to change that risk paradigm that I talked about before, act on those commitments, and importantly, so measure and importantly, report on those results transparently, because that focus on reporting in a transparent manner is what's going to lead organizations to really stick to that commitment and to that goal. Next slide, please. Just the last parting slide here. This is a view of our global impact since inception. So in our career here, we have prevented over 100 million pounds of food waste to date, or 45 million kilos. That translates to significant savings in emissions in water and meals here, as you notice. Next slide. And that's it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Really fascinating developments here.
Thank you.
Really, yeah, interesting how much has already been done, and of course, there's always demand for more. So, your focus, it seemed, was very much at the business level, let's say, whether retail and beyond. My one question was, could this approach or this technology be used, for example, at the level of a city organization, as an institution like Kathmandu, or a school setting, let's say, so in a sense, is the approach fungible, transferable to different scales of operation?
Yeah, good question, and definitely so. We work with a lot of schools and colleges and universities, so definitely workable there. And I mentioned that enterprise reporting capability there. So if you deploy in an entire school system, for example, or a college or a university, you can use that functionality to track and, as I like to call it, create positive competition amongst all of the sites in general. And I think that's a really healthy thing for those organizations to do. So yes, definitely able to implement in schools, universities, as you say, and also to take that a little higher and think about it at the city level. Yes, I mean the technology is easily deployed, and so I think really what that takes is the really important policy levers to this is where policy, legislation, perhaps even regulation comes into play to to create that environment to where organizations are have the responsibility to deploy this measurement focused process to reduce waste across their city or their region. And I think it's eminently doable. I think as we've talked about awareness so far today, I think as this movement, if you will, continues and the awareness grows, and as we get closer to 2030, for example, and as everyone really realizes the imperative of food waste reduction and the key ability of food waste reduction, that linkage effect to other SDGs, all of the global drivers are aligned behind food waste reduction. So I think we will see more policy action that will kind of get to the level to your question, which will say, how do we implement such technology across all of the various sectors of food operations within our region? And I think that will probably be coming to a greater degree in future years.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned the P word, policy, because action has to happen from both ends, right? You can have a policy, well, global targets and national policies, but if you're not measuring at the appropriate levels, including municipal waste and school system wide, not just individual schools, you're going to have a hard time linking the goal with the actions and awareness at a more granular level. Rezul Betos is asking, is there, I believe POC means point of contact for the system you're talking about. To whom can one reach out? And are there names of companies that have adopted that can be shared so that people can have a look at what their achievements are and best practices?
Sure, good question. And I'll put my contact information in the chat here. Many organizations that we are working with, I mentioned that I think we're deployed in about 4,000 plus locations around the world, over 40 countries. We are doing a large deployment with Sodexo globally in numerous countries, and I think a Google search will find, with LeanPath and Sodexo, we'll find information on that, and we will have it on our website as well. Sodexo, Compass Group, Aramark, Google, we mentioned Google at the start of the call here. We have case studies on our website. There's a tab at the top of that where people can look there as well. And we have a YouTube channel with a number of videos as well. And so you can see some of the work with Google and Marriott and others.
Yeah, the YouTube, that would be great. Are there any at all in more middle income, low income countries that you can?
Yes, I don't have the country list off the top of my head, but yes, we are through Europe, through APAC as well. So yes, I just don't have that list handy.
Yeah, that's great, because many of the participants are from resource constrained countries, and so they're absolutely looking for the appropriate technologies and approaches and examples that they can build from. Seta, I'm going to ask you to come back again and join us as well for these last 10 minutes, just to see if there are any additional questions or any additional comments from your side. Do you have any things to add based on Steve's presentation?
No, I think Steve covered it and demonstrated, like in real with real cases, what you can do. I did see one question though in the Q&A, which talks about if you do one intervention at one point in the food system, would it result in leakages or reduced waste or losses in other stages? And yes, there are. This is that's why one of the fundamental things is when we look at intervention, for it to be built on evidence, and also for it to look at it in a systemic way. Now, for instance, many retailers now, they just choose the best produce that's out there. So something that would be near ripening maybe, but they wouldn't choose something that is more ripe, and that would lead to losses, for instance, whether it is at the farmer's side or whether it's at the distributor's side, while these fruits or vegetables can still be eaten and still be put in retail. So this is a kind of an intervention in the retail to reduce their losses, and looking mainly at their economic losses. Basically results in that there is waste occurring in other phases of the food system. And that's why at the national, like, it's important to do measurement at the institutional level. So for institutions like what Steve demonstrated, the institution itself knows what's happening within the institution, and they can take measures at the institution level. But there's also an importance for cities, municipalities, and countries to do the measurement at a more macro level, to be able to look at the whole system and identify what measures can be taken so that these kind of losses and waste can be reduced by maybe deflecting them to other uses along the way, redistributing it, moving along the valorization, that hierarchy that we discussed.
And so just to build on that, I would say I saw that point in there, and just in my mind always goes to when you think about one thing to do, and there are many. But mine would be in each case, move upward, move in terms of thoughts, go to the top of the hierarchy as you indicated, because that is where it's the point of maximum impact for all organizations, right? And so if we can shift the conversation and actions, but really I think more important, essentially the cultural mindset among everyone to act to prevent the occurrence of waste in the first place. And if we can't do that, then go downstream, but really push that emphasis up to the greatest degree that we can, because the most impact, obviously, 80% of the GHG impact from food waste in the food waste space can be avoided through food waste prevention. So it's a big number, right? If we can prevent that food from being produced in the first place and moved all the way through the chain and ultimately being wasted. So there's a lot of cultural change that needs to occur, but I think through all of that, if we can all think about prevention first, it would be a powerful one.
Yeah, mindset change has come up certainly many times. And there were a couple of questions essentially about how, beyond using apps and technology, are there broader suggestions from either of you in terms of what's the agenda for raising awareness? Because that's where mindfulness is going to happen, right?
Yeah. So I would add that it's changing awareness, changing behaviors, but also introducing enablers. Like in different countries, loss and waste occurs for different reasons. Like there's an excellent program by World Food Program where they are supporting airtight storage, plastic storage for communities, for producers in across Africa, because aflatoxins and humidity during storing of grain is a big problem. So sometimes the behavior is there, but the economic capability is not there. So we need enablers as well. So each target and each community should be targeted with interventions that are suitable for that community, and that's the fundamental thing behind the Target Measure Act. Measure to understand local conditions. We can't just import something from another country, an intervention, because it worked there or in another institution in another dimension, and say it would work here without really analyzing and ensuring that the local conditions and the reasons for the loss or waste are similar.
And I would just add to that, showing impact. I mentioned showing the visibility and using stories to convey all these things. To your point, Patrick, about education and awareness. The impact for business operations, food service in particular, is tremendous, right? In terms of both financial savings, environmental impact, and the social impact as well. So showing that impact and kind of bringing that realization into and addressing that cultural mindset that I mentioned before, where the risk paradigm isn't typically focused from the start on food waste reduction, but it's kind of engaged in behaviors that actually leads more waste. So that's kind of I look at that as kind of a breakthrough moment, and really in that process, kind of getting organizations to think differently and really think about true risks that we're all dealing with, being climate change and food insecurity, and reorienting our operational risk paradigms around that.
And augmenting that with the proper policy and regulatory framework, because sometimes like there is awareness, individuals or institutions want to do something, but then the policy and regulatory framework is not there. For instance, I can give the example of the black soldier flies. If we're looking across the MENA region, there is a big opportunity for that industry, but the policy and regulatory framework is not there. So there's limited chances somebody would put big investments without having that backup. But that goes to other things as well.
Yeah, there's two dimensions of policy.
Yes,
One
exactly.
is the regulatory framework, the food
exactly.
safety legislation, and so on. But the other, you talked about enablers, is incentives, right?
Yes.
From a commercial perspective, the incentive is adequate, probably adequate in terms of money saved, right? Loss reduced or prevented goes to the bottom line. For governments, both Maya and Hala are talking about, well, what about governments? What about incentives for smaller businesses? Well, a lot of that is going to relate to how setting targets by governments, but finding ways to enable everyone to act differently, not just make savings, but there may need to be incentives, tax incentives, or programs promoting financing to SMEs to invest in new technologies or packaging, right? So do you want to just finally, as in the last few minutes, speak to that, the role of government?
Yes, so government has a big role. First of all, with the UNEP's latest food waste index, governments are actually required now to start reporting on their food waste. So they're asked to start measuring and reporting on it. So as that comes along, of course, there is going to be more realization of the magnitude of the problem. So there's also big incentives with meeting the Paris Agreement to look at how can they reduce food waste as part of their national determined contributions. So behind the big targets needs to come a supporting regulatory framework that really allows institutions to start investing in these different valorization options. So currently, for instance, many governments are looking at waste to energy. And part of it is not being aware that waste to energy actually is not going to be accounted as a reduction in food waste or food loss. It's actually still going to be accounted as food waste. And also providing the economic incentive. Some of these new industries would need pre-seed funding, seed funding, also funding until they are really capable to stand on their feet. And if that's not available under local conditions, even if you put the policies and regulatory frameworks there, it would be difficult to have that economy emerging up. So,
and I would add to set this comment also. As part of this awareness raising, and the incentives are great, in the policy realm, financial incentives to enable organizations to engage more easily in deployment of technology, and they will achieve the payment, month by month. The savings reduction going forward month by month is a great one. I would also emphasize a couple of things. The multiplier effect that I mentioned before, as cities, governments, regional organizations are thinking about how to advance this work. I would emphasize that multiplier effect where, if you are reducing food waste in your community, in your area, you are also reducing plastics pollution. You are also saving water. You are also, preventing deforestation. All of those great benefits, right? You're freeing up scarce resources to solve root causes of hunger. So those benefits really important. I think that is critical to the culture shift. And to that point about moving the conversation up, Seta mentioned the diversion to anaerobic digestion and things like that. We need to convey that we don't overproduction is really the key here, and that is the environment and is really taxed. And so we don't want to we don't produce food just to run it through the system, and we shouldn't feel good about necessarily feel great about the fact that if at the end of the day we've routed a massive amount of excess food to anaerobic digestion for energy. It's not an efficient use of what we why we produce food, right? And so again,
Right.
throughout this whole process, shifting people's mindsets up to prevent the occurrence of waste in the first place.
Great points. At the end of the day, it's not a single technology or a practice. It's a mindset that applies in a bundle, policies, practices, technologies, but with people at the center. And mindsets have to change, not just at the household level, but the government level, the business level, and so on. So thank you both so much. Thank you for all the participants for staying through to this. Thank you, Steve and Sita, for wonderful presentations, discussions, ideas. And to all participants, stay tuned for the third upcoming webinar in this series, which will be just as exciting and interesting as we've had today. So much appreciated, and be safe and well.
Thank you, Patrick, for moderating this as well and organizing it.
Yes.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.